Correct. All right, we're going to get started. On behalf of the Partnership for Strong Communities, welcome to our last day of the second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. The Partnership for Strong Communities is dedicated to ensuring everyone in Connecticut has a safe, stable home that's affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice where they can thrive. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm the Deputy Director for the Partnership for Strong Communities, and I'm really happy to be with you today and introducing our keynote speaker. Before we get started, this event wouldn't be possible without the support of our generous sponsors who make Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference a success. Excuse me, I'm tripping on my words today, and free for you to attend. Thank you to our leading sponsors and critical partners, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and Melville Charitable Trust. We're grateful for our collaborating sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Rockport Mortgage, and Webster Bank. We also have a bunch of supporting sponsors that have made this conference happen that you see up on your screen. And we are so honored to welcome Mr. Richard Rothstein, or Richard, as a keynote speaker at this year's Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. Richard is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute, of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to his book, The Color of Law, he's the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute, and we'll share those links in the chat. Previous influential books include Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Improvement to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. Lucky for us, Richard welcomes questions and comments at his email address, which we'll share. And lucky for you, he's welcoming your questions and comments today. So you can submit those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Partnership for Strong Communities Senior Policy Analyst Kaylee Pratt will be monitoring them and providing them to Mr. Rothstein at the end of his talk. So thank you for being with us today, Richard. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chelsea, and thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. Let me begin by reminding all of us that we had a civil rights movement in this country in the 20th century. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, then went on to challenge racial segregation in colleges and universities, all institutions of higher education. And then in 1954, as you know, it succeeded in persuading the Supreme Court to prohibit segregation in elementary and secondary schools. That Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, in demonstrations, in civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. Many were seriously injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded the country, I'm not suggesting everybody, but most people, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. With that understanding, and with the good trouble that it caused, in the words of the late Congressman John Lewis, it succeeded in ending segregation in public accommodations and restaurants. It succeeded in ending segregation in public transportation, buses, trains. It succeeded in ending segregation in employment. And in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. That Brown versus Board of Education decision was the last major accomplishment of the civil rights movement. It pretty much ended after that and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area is racially segregated. I lived in many of them. Everyone that I lived in had clearly defined areas that were either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all Black or mostly Black. How could it be if we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. How could we have left untouched the biggest segregation of all? We live in an apartheid society, and we all accept it. Well, part of the reason is that it's hard to undo residential segregation once we've established it. If we want to abolish segregation in restaurants, we pass laws prohibiting segregation in restaurants, and the next day, anybody can go to any restaurant they want. If we abolish segregation in buses, the next day, you sit anywhere you want on a bus. But we pass a law prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, and the next day, things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to redress the biggest segregation of all. And that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that, oh, the segregation of restaurants or buses, that was all done by government. If state governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, the civil rights violation. And we have an obligation as American citizens to fix that. We understand that. If the federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation, also a violation of the Constitution, something we have an obligation to fix. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally, happened by accident. It happened because bigoted white homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or because perhaps private businesses, banks, real estate agencies, developers refused to sell or rent to African Americans. Or maybe we tell ourselves, this has become a much more common form of the rationalization later. Oh, blacks and whites just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all economics. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites. It's not true of all African Americans, but on average they do. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector actions, self-choice, economic trends is what caused residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We think it's too bad, most of us do, if we think about it, that we live in a highly segregated and apartheid society, but we don't feel a constitutional obligation as American citizens to do anything about it. Well, I spent most of my time before I wrote the book that I'm speaking about today, The Color of Law. I spent it writing about education policy. I didn't know much about housing, but I was writing about education policy. And in the 1990s, I came to understand that the education policy that we're following in this country made no sense. It was broadly supported by both Democrats and Republicans, but the policy argued that we have an achievement gap between black and white children. Black children, on average, again, not all, but on average, achieve at lower levels than white children. And we told ourselves that the reason we have that achievement gap is because teachers of black children are lazy. They don't try very hard. They have low expectations, was the term we used. And if only we could force teachers to try harder when they teach black children, the achievement gap would disappear. I thought this was a ludicrous theory. But this was, as I say, widely shared across the political spectrum. In 2001, we passed a law enacting this theory. It was called the No Child Left Behind law. It required children to be tested every year, their test scores reported by race. And the theory of the law was that if teachers could see that their African American children were achieving at lower levels than white children, they'd be so shamed that they would try harder and the achievement gap would disappear. The law predicted in just 7 years it would be gone. Ludicrous theory. Today, the achievement gap is just about as big as it was in 2001 when we passed that law. But the only thing that the law accomplished was that it forced schools to, it gave them an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and instead focus inordinate attention on drilling children to take tests. Well, I understood at the time, and I think many people do now, that lazy teachers is not the cause of the achievement gap. The cause of the achievement gap is the social and economic conditions that so many African-American children come to school with that impede their ability to learn. And, you know, I was a New York Times education columnist, and I remember writing a column about asthma. As you may know, African-American children have asthma at a much higher rate than middle-class white children. In some metropolitan areas, 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. Black children have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, closer to industrial facilities, more trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings that they live in, more vermin in the environment, more empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't. It's not true in every case. I only talk about averages, but it's more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to come to school drowsy the next day because the child has been up at night wheezing. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, but one group has a higher rate of asthma, that group is going to have somewhat lower average achievement just because it's going to be a sleepier group. Now, that doesn't make a big difference. Asthma makes a tiny contribution to the achievement gap. But then you begin to think of all of the other social and economic conditions that children come to school with. Asthma, lead poisoning. African-American children have lead poisoning at a much higher rate than white children because they are more likely to live in buildings with peeling paint that contains lead before it was prohibited for more modern buildings. They're more likely to be receiving their water from pipes, lead pipes that are now prohibited. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity. You begin to add up all of these conditions that African-American children, so many of them, not all, so many of them come to school with, and you pretty much explained the achievement gap. It doesn't leave much explanation for lazy teachers. Well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or is homeless or is economically insecure. It's another thing if you have a school where every child has one or more of these conditions. How can such a school where you've concentrated the children with these disadvantages, how can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come healthy, well-rested, from economically secure homes, well-nourished? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you pass requiring it if you don't deal with those underlying conditions. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I, as an education policy writer, began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was a school problem. I still wasn't thinking about it in housing terms. Well, this is what I was thinking about in 2007, when I read a Supreme Court decision in the field of education. The Supreme Court evaluated the program in 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had trivial school desegregation plans. They permitted parents to choose which school in the district their child would attend. But if the child was going to intensify segregation by that choice, the choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't intensify segregation. So, for example, if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, and both a black and a white child applied for that last remaining place, the black child would be given some preference. Trivial program. You don't have one place left in the school very often. But the Supreme Court evaluated this program. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The court denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. It was unconstitutional, according to the court, to have this trivial desegregation plan. And the Chief Justice, in his opinion, explained it's true. He said the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods are segregated de facto, was the term he used, because of all of those non-governmental actions that I described a few minutes ago, private bigotry, private discrimination, self-choice, economic trends. And he said, where you have de facto segregation, something that the government did not create, had no role in creating. The Constitution prohibits you from doing anything to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered hearing about something that happened some years before in Louisville, Kentucky. There was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police never did anything to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police never did anything to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. Maybe there's something about the history of Louisville that Chief Justice John Roberts doesn't want to know. And I began to look into it further, and I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases like this in Hartford, in New York, in Washington and Baltimore and Chicago and Kansas City and Los Angeles and San Francisco, of police protected, sometimes police led and organized mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods. Every one of these cases where the police was involved in failing to stop the violence or organizing and leading it was a 14th Amendment violation of the Constitution, something that we as American citizens, all of us, have an obligation to redress, obligation to remedy the effects of this. And we've never accepted that obligation. I began to look into it further, and I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the segregation that we know today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit. I'm not now talking about policies that had an unintended effect. Racially explicit policies designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. Every one of these policies was a violation of the Constitution, as I've said. I know I overemphasize this point, but it needs overemphasis. A violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments that we, all of us, have an obligation to remedy. Well, let me describe some of these policies. I don't have time to do many of them. As you know, I've written a book about this, The Color of Law, but perhaps the most powerful of them was a policy of the federal government, the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations in the immediate post-World War II period, when they embarked on a program to move the entire white population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white single-family suburbs, like that one outside Louisville that I described before. This was a racially explicit policy. As background, I need to explain to you something you may not know, and that is, at this time in American history, up to this time in American history, we were not a suburban country. Most whites, as well as African Americans, working families, as well as middle-class families, lived in urban areas. They weren't living in suburbs. The reason was we were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to locate near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. And so if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they all had to live in broadly the same neighborhood so they could walk to work, maybe take short streetcar rides. I'm not suggesting that every neighborhood was integrated, but many of them were integrated. This is how we exist. Middle-class workers as well, who worked at banks or other industries that were servicing the factories, also had to live relatively close to them. Well, the federal government wanted to move the whites out of these urban areas and keep the African Americans in them. So it embarked on a program to suburbanize the country on a white basis. You know these suburbs that are created everywhere in the country, around Hartford, around New York, and everywhere else. Perhaps the best known example is Levittown, east of New York City, I use this as the example to describe in my book because it's so well known, so large, 17,000 homes in one place. Levitt, the builder, he was a bigot. He bragged about the fact that he would not sell to an African American if he had the choice, but he didn't have a choice. He couldn't get the money to build this development. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to buy the land and build 17,000 homes in one place. The only way he could get the funds to build this giant project was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design of the homes, the materials he was going to use, the layout of the streets, and a federally required commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans, or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. Wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA or VA. It was written out in a federal policy manual, an underwriting manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate applications of builders to build these suburban homes. The manual said that you could not approve for a federal bank guarantee or recommend for a federal bank guarantee a proposal to build a development that would have both blacks and whites in it. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even approve a proposal for an all-white development if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. The federal government was blatantly violating its constitutional obligations under the Fifth Amendment, irregardless of what Levitt personally felt. If the federal government had told him, as it was required to do under the Constitution, yes, we'll guarantee your bank loans, but then you have to sell on a non-discriminatory basis. Had the federal government done that, Levittown and all of these suburbs and every metropolitan area in this country would be integrated places today. These homes were not expensive. They were very inexpensive. They were sold for, at the time, and this is true everywhere, for about $8,000 a piece, mid-20th century. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Returning war veterans were required to make no down payment. There were many African Americans who were qualified to buy these homes, but prohibited from doing so. Those homes that sold for $100,000 a piece now don't sell for $100,000 anymore, not around Hartford, not around New York, not in any metropolitan area of this country. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes with this federal subsidy, working class families, gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation in the value of their homes, the equity that they gained as the homes appreciated in value. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, temporary unemployment or medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans are prohibited by federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. If they suffered temporary unemployment, they were pushed further down the economic scale in more impoverished conditions that lasted for generations. That wealth gap is responsible for much of the inequality we have today. African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes today on average. There's a gap there. It would take another lecture to explain how that arose, but you would think that if African American family incomes were about 60% of white family incomes, African American wealth would be similarly 60% of white wealth, household wealth. But in reality, although African American family incomes are 60% of white family incomes, African American household wealth is only about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. It's never been remedied, that we, I say again, have never accepted our responsibility as American citizens to remedy. That wealth gap underlies much of the social inequality, economic inequality, racial inequality we have in this country today. I earlier described the achievement gap. That's largely the result of the fact that we concentrate children with the most serious disadvantages in single schools. They're concentrated there because their families have no wealth by which they can make down payments or could have made down payments later in the 20th century to purchase homes in higher opportunity neighborhoods. The wealth gap is determined to a large extent of health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in less healthy neighborhoods in which they're locked in because of the inability to have the resources to find better housing. They live in more polluted neighborhoods that contributes to poor health. They don't have access to supermarkets that sell fresh food. They live in more stressful, overcrowded conditions. It also contributes significantly to police abuse of African American men. I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse a young man if it weren't for the racial segregation that we created in large part by this FHA and VA policy. But it's much more intense because of it when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs or the transportation to get to those jobs, or the schools that aren't overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their pupils. When you concentrate those young men in those neighborhoods, it's inevitable that the police are going to engage in confrontations with them, that they're going to adopt the kinds of tactics that police forces adopt anywhere in the world when they're controlling a restive, low-income, non-powerful population, whether it was in colonial countries in the 20th century, India or the Congo. Police tactics aren't much different there than they are here, and for similar reasons. And the wealth gap and the segregation that it created is also responsible for something else that's very, very frightening and dangerous. And that's the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today. It's not entirely racial, but I think we all know that it largely tracks racial lines. How could we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other? Do we have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other, no ability to appreciate each other's life experiences? How can we ever develop the common national identity that's so essential to the preservation of this democracy under these conditions? It's hard to imagine. Well, this is just one of many policies that the federal government followed to create segregation. I'll mention one other and then move on to a couple of concluding remarks. Public housing, something that we all misunderstand. Most of us think public housing is a place where poor people live. Lots of young mothers with children. Lots of single men, like I described before, with no opportunities for jobs in the formal economy. This is our image of public housing, but that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began for the first time. The first public housing projects were built during the Depression, in the New Deal, in the Roosevelt administration. They weren't for poor people. We had a large, very high unemployment rate in the Depression of the 1930s. 25% unemployment rate at one point. Public housing was not for the 25% who were unemployed, but for the 75% who had jobs, stable incomes, could pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. It wasn't subsidized. Public housing was built because working class families couldn't find housing because no housing was being constructed in the Depression. The Public Works Administration, as I said, built the first public housing in this country during the New Deal. And everywhere it built it, it segregated it. I'm not talking about the South. I'm talking about the North and the Midwest throughout the country. creating separate projects for African Americans and whites, frequently segregating those urban neighborhoods that I described before, some of which were integrated, segregating them for the first time. In my book, The Color of Law, I describe the great African American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, who describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today as an integrated neighborhood, but he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. This was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood of Cleveland. Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. In my book, The Color of Law, I sometimes like to use as examples smug, self-satisfied places that think they're better than the rest of us. One of them you may be familiar with, Cambridge, Massachusetts, not so far from you. The area between Harvard and MIT was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was about half white and half black. The Public Works Administration demolished some housing in that neighborhood, and the federal government built two projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other projects elsewhere in the Boston area that were also segregated, created the segregated patterns that we know today. During World War II, after the New Deal, hundreds of thousands of workers, black and white, flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries, jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. They overwhelmed the communities to which they migrated to take these jobs. And if the federal government wanted the tanks and the jeeps and the ships and the airplanes to be produced, it had to find housing for these workers. So it did. The federal government built housing all over the country for war workers who were working in war plants, war production plants, and everywhere it built segregated housing, frequently creating segregation where we know it hadn't previously existed. And the best example of that is the West Coast, where there were very few African Americans prior to World War II. Historians divide the migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country into two periods. One was the first great migration, which brought African Americans to places like Hartford and New York and Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh, not to the West Coast. African Americans came in large numbers to the West Coast only during World War II to take jobs in war industries. They migrated from Texas and Louisiana. The first great migration that brought African Americans to your area came from South Carolina and Georgia. Well, African Americans came to California, for example, for the first time during World War II to take jobs in war industries, and the government provided housing for them on a segregated basis. In San Francisco, the government built 5 projects. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African American war workers placed in a community in San Francisco that later became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. It wasn't that before. In the East Bay, there were large shipyards in Richmond, California. Just south of that, in Berkeley, in Albany, California, the government built housing for those shipyard workers. The white workers were placed in separate projects near the residential areas of Berkeley and Albany and shopping areas. The African Americans were placed distant from that along the railroad tracks and the manufacturing facilities near the bay, creating segregation where it clearly had not existed prior to World War II. Well, let me say that the policies to redress segregation are well known. No mystery about them. Policy experts, journalists like me, propose policies all the time that could redress segregation. What's missing is not policies, but a new civil rights movement, like the one we had in the 1960s, that's going to raise the temperature of this issue of segregation and create the political conditions by which these policies can be enacted. And let me just take a minute or so to describe what some of these might look like. They're so politically unrealistic, you'll think I'm silly in describing them, but they're constitutionally required. I gave an example of, for example, a Levittown, all white, homes are sold for $100,000, affordable when it was built, now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The Fair Housing Act said in effect to African Americans, okay, you can now move to Levittown. Nobody's going to stop you. But the reality is, of course, that neither whites nor blacks, working class or middle class, can afford homes in a place like Levittown today, even though they were affordable when it was created, $300,000, $400,000, unless they have bequests from their grandparents or parents for down payments, as well as the income to support a large mortgage. African Americans typically don't. A few do. Levittown today is now about 1% to 2% African American. In a broader neighborhood, that's close to 15% African American. Well, what would be a narrowly targeted remedy for this blatant constitutional violation that makes Levittown nearly an all-white community? Well, the federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown when they come for sale, $300,000, $400,000 market rate, and resell them to African Americans at deeply discounted prices. Maybe not $100,000, but deeply discounted prices that would be affordable to working and middle-class African Americans. That would be a very narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. We're not about to do something like that because it's politically inconceivable, but we need to, and we need a new civil rights movement that's going to demand policies like that. We have policies for low-income families that are disproportionately African American for their housing that enforce and reinforce segregation today. The biggest program for African Americans, well, it's for low-income families, disproportionately African Americans, Hispanics as well today, is the low-income housing tax credit. That's, as you know, a credit issued to states that then distribute them to nonprofit organizations who then sell them to developers to build housing for low-income families. The low-income housing tax credit disproportionately reinforces segregation because its units are disproportionately placed in low-income neighborhoods. Developers would rather build in low-income neighborhoods with this tax credit. They'd rather do so because the land is cheaper there. They don't have to hold a dozen community meetings explaining why they're bringing Black or brown people into your neighborhood. And it's easy to rent. You can place a sign in the window if you have it in a low-income neighborhood, and people walking by can see an apartment for rent. That's a violation of the Constitution to disproportionately place these units in low-income neighborhoods, even though it's not a racially explicit program, but it reinforces segregation. We can very easily modify that program to require priorities for placing those units in higher opportunity neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of even townhouses or garden apartments or multi-unit structures of any kind. The same thing is true of the Section 8 program. Section 8 program, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, reinforces segregation because most Section 8 voucher holders can only find apartments in existing low-income neighborhoods. Landlords, even if they're prohibited by law to discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders, do so anyway because the law is very poorly enforced. As you probably know, the formula for developing the amount of a Section 8 voucher is based on an area-wide median rent. It doesn't take a genius to realize that if you subsidize someone to be able to afford the area-wide median rent, that the subsidy is going to be too low to rent in higher opportunity neighborhoods. It's actually too high to rent in low-income segregated neighborhoods, and landlords in those neighborhoods exploit the Section 8 voucher program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. We could change that formula. We do in a few experimental places, but most places nationwide we do not. And so the Section 8 voucher program winds up reinforcing segregation. Well, let me conclude by saying that I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation. They plan to launch it in the winter of 2022, just in a few months. Their aim is to place organizers in white and Black communities around the country to try to create civil rights groups. They'll specifically try to create the momentum for policies that redress segregation, that improve the resources in low-income communities, as well as create opportunities in higher opportunity places for African Americans to live. I hope that you'll participate in that effort, or at least some of you will when it's launched. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rothstein. I'm sure that there is certainly a virtual applause happening on everyone's, on the other side of everyone's screens right now. So really great. And it was a wonderful set of remarks there. We are getting some questions in the chat. So I will go ahead and ask a couple of those. This past legislative session and some sessions previously, there have been efforts to change local exclusionary zoning practices in Connecticut, expand housing types, and to answer deep racial segregation. Can you comment on how you view zoning reforms and a fair share housing system in efforts to address racial segregation and integrate Connecticut?
Well, I think it's essential. Zoning reform, I think exclusionary zoning, and I talk about this a bit in The Color of Law. Exclusionary zoning was developed explicitly to make sure that African Americans couldn't move in to white neighborhoods. We should prohibit it. We should prohibit single family zoning. But I want to say this, simply prohibiting single family zoning, permitting townhouses and garden apartments and even low-level multi-unit structures is not going to create desegregation, because in today's tight housing market, creating more housing opportunities like that will still permit whites who need housing, middle-class whites, and we have a housing shortage for working-class families of both races, are going to outbid African Americans for many of those, most of those opportunities. So we need explicit policies, explicit subsidies to redress segregation. Simply a race-neutral abolition of exclusionary zoning is not itself going to solve this problem. So far as a fair share program, I also support that, but I want to emphasize that simply creating a low-income development inside an otherwise high-end community, creating internal segregation within the suburb, in some ways reinforces the problem that we face. We need mixed income housing, and we should ensure that while we have a fair share requirement, that fair share requirement doesn't lead to a segregated enclave inside an otherwise high opportunity community. We should be creating mixed income housing that mixes market rate, working family, there's workforce housing, and housing for low-income families.
Thank you. Another question regarding home ownership opportunities. So the question is that there's an imbalance in the federal, in the funding of the federal government that puts into affordable housing rental units. LIHTC goes almost entirely to rental units. Should that be redirected to home ownership opportunities to help people build them?
Well, I agree with that as well. Home ownership is, rates are very different for African Americans and whites. White families, 70% of white families own their own homes. Only 40% of Black families own their own homes. That's in part the result of the wealth gap that I described that was created by the FHA and VA. And also, it's in large part the result of the subprime lending practices that were racially discriminatory practiced by banks and mortgage originators in the lead up to the 2008 housing collapse. At that time, banks in particular and mortgage originators targeted African Americans and Hispanics for exploitative subprime loans. As evidence submitted in a number of court cases against major banks in this country, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, demonstrated that banks use tactics like sending mortgage marketers to black churches on Sunday to promote loans with teaser interest rates, that is very low interest rates. These were refinancing, home refinance loans with low teaser rates that would explode later on, but the promotion and the marketing didn't disclose easily the later exploding interest rates. They had very high prepayment penalties. And the result was that there were disparate number of foreclosures, enormous numbers of foreclosures on African-American homeowners in 2008 and later, when these interest rates exploded and they were no longer able to pay their mortgages. Home ownership then plummeted, and it has not recovered to any significant extent for African Americans, although home ownership rates for whites has recovered. And that's because the lack of wealth in African American neighborhoods. Once you lose a home, it's virtually impossible to get back into home ownership without racially explicit subsidy policies that are necessary. So I agree that home ownership is a very important target of race-conscious advocates, racial equality advocates, and the federal government is not at this point subsidizing home ownership for African Americans, which it should be doing.
Thank you. I see a couple questions in the chat around the new movement that you had, the new civil rights movement you had referenced. First, I'll kind of combine them into a two-parter. The first, that there's some existing organizations that are working on the ground, and how you think a new organization might fit into that. And then also why a new movement is needed, and why not invest in kind of current civil rights movement?
Well, I'm not directly involved in organizing this, but I know that they plan to work with existing organizations to help to support them where they exist. There are many places in this country where they don't exist and where it will be necessary to create it. But focusing on the kinds of policies that are necessary to redress segregation are not always covered by existing organizations. And as I said, it's necessary to support existing organizations where they do so, but it's also necessary to create new ones where they don't exist, or where existing organizations are not focused on the redress of segregation. And let me describe the four areas that this new movement to redress racial segregation is going to focus on. One is improving investment in existing low-income Black neighborhoods. That's absolutely essential. If African Americans are going to have opportunities that were denied to them through the policies I described, improving the conditions in those low-income neighborhoods is absolutely essential, and we have denied that in the past. Second is preventing massive displacement where gentrification exists, where African American neighborhoods are suddenly becoming attractive to whites, and the existing residents sometimes find themselves unable to afford to live in the communities where they've lived in for many, many years, sometimes generations. The policies, again, to do that are well known, but we're not implementing them. I don't have time to go into them now, but these are policies that are generally not the focus of existing organizations. The third is opening up opportunities in existing high opportunity, mostly white middle-class communities for African Americans to live, both as homeowners and as renters. And this is an area that there is very little work being done on now, and that's an area of focus that's essential. And finally, is the fourth area is stabilizing desegregation where it exists, so that you don't have white flight, which is a characteristic still of many communities that's become diverse, and so that the desegregation is stabilized. And that's another area that is not a focus of existing organizations and where organizing needs to be done. I'll give you just one quick example of that. I don't want to take a lot of time on it, but long ago, there was an interest in this kind of policy. It's not a focus anymore, but there's a community outside Chicago, Oak Park, that adopted an insurance plan against a property value loss when it started to become integrated, to assure white homeowners that they wouldn't lose in property value because their neighborhood was becoming desegregated. The insurance plan was eventually terminated because they never had to pay out any benefits. People pay premiums, but their property values never declined as the neighborhood desegregated, and so the thing was terminated. But there's a need for that kind of thing again today in many, many suburban communities that are beginning to desegregate. So that's an area that needs focus that nobody is working on today. So there's room for a new movement. I asked Kaylee you before if you want to send out information after this webinar to people who've registered, and I'll send out a link where you can sign up to receive information when this new movement launches.
Thank you so much. I think we might have time for one, maybe two more quick questions. The first, and I think you started kind of touched on it briefly in that last, there was a question around social housing and large scale municipal housing built and owned by the state as an option for solving the affordability crisis. Do you have any thoughts on that movement?
Oh, sure. Social housing is just a European term for public housing, which is a word that we don't like to use here. But yes, we need public housing like we had in the 1930s, but integrated, not segregated. Public housing that's not just for the poor, but for working and middle-class families as well, because we have an enormous housing shortage today, not just for the poor, but for working and middle-class families. And that public housing that we should build, we can call it social housing if we like, should be desegregated and for families of various income levels, not just for the poor.
And if we have time for a very quick follow-up to that, you spoke a bit about the misconception attached to public housing, and that it's closely connected with public housing projects that have largely been neglected from public investment. What do you propose for remedies for the hundreds of families left behind in poor housing conditions? That'll be our last question.
Well, there are many, many remedies. As I said, we need reinvestment in low-income neighborhoods, as well as mobility programs that allow those families to find other housing opportunities. We need mixed income housing built in those neighborhoods. So as I suggested, we need to preserve gentrification without displacement, so that communities become truly mixed income and mixed race in a healthy fashion. I don't have time to go into all the policies. I'll give you a couple real quickly. We need rent control in those neighborhoods that's firm, not with all the loopholes that those communities that have rent control now permit. We need limits on condominium conversions so that those neighborhoods don't wind up expelling all the existing residents. We need freezes on property taxes for existing homeowners, so that people who've lived in their homes, maybe paid off all their mortgages, own their homes outright, but can no longer afford to live in them because their property taxes rise as the neighborhoods improve. So we need to freeze property taxes for existing homeowners and collect the lost property taxes only at point of sale when they're sold for much more than the homeowners paid for them.
Thank you. And with that, I do have to wrap up. Unfortunately, there are many questions, and I really wish we had more time to jump even deeper. But again, thank you so much, Mr. Rothstein. We appreciate your willingness to join us this morning, as well as all of your hard work and advocacy. Thank you to all of our attendees. Please join us for our next session, which is back on the Zoom events platform. That session is going to be the surrounding the Connecticut's Qualified Action Plan. So that starts right now at 11. And we're so happy you joined us today. And again, thank you, Mr. Rothstein, and we will I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.